Bear Grylls, the autobiography, Mud, Sweat and Tears. Prologue. The air temperature is minus 20 degrees. I wiggle my fingers, but they're still freezing cold. Old frostnip injuries never let you forget. I blame Everest for that. You set, buddy? Cameraman Simon asks me, smiling. His rig is all prepped and ready. I smile back. I'm unusually nervous. Something doesn't quite feel right. But I don't listen to the inner voice. It's time to go to work. The crew tell me that the crisp northern Canadian Rockies look spectacular this morning. I don't really notice. It's time to get into my secret space, a rare part of me that is focused, clear, brave, precise. It is part of me I know the best, but visit the least. I only like to use it sparingly, like now. Beneath me is 300 feet of steep snow and ice, steep but manageable. I have done this sort of fast descent many, many times. Never be complacent, the voice says. The voice is always right. A last deep breath, a look to Simon, a silent acknowledgement back. Yet we have cut a vital corner. I know it, but I do nothing. I leap. I am instantly taken by the speed. Normally I love it. This time I am worried. I never feel worried in the moment. I know something is wrong. I am soon travelling at over 40 miles per hour, feet first down the mountain. The ice races past only inches from my head. This is my world. I gain even more speed. The edge of the peak gets closer. Time to arrest the fall. I flip nimbly onto my front and drive the ice axe into the snow. A cloud of white spray and ice soars into the air. I can feel the rapid deceleration as I grind the axe deep into the mountain with all my power. It works like it always does, like clockwork. Total confidence. One of those rare moments of lucidity. It is fleeting, then it is gone. I am now static. The world hangs still. Then, bang! Simon, his heavy wooden sledge plus solid metal camera housing, piles straight into my left thigh. He is doing in excess of 45 miles per hour. There's an instant explosion of pain and noise and white. It's like a freight train, and I'm thrown down the mountain like a doll. Life stands still. I feel and I see it all in slow motion. Yet, in that split second, I only have one realisation, a 1 degree different course, and the sledge's impact would have been with my head. Without doubt, it would have been my last living thought. Instead, I am in agony, writhing. I am crying. There are tears of relief. I am injured, but I am alive. I see a helicopter, but hear no sound. Then the hospital. I have been in a few since Man vs. Wild, Born Survivor, Bear Grylls began. I hate them. I can see them all through closed eyes. The dirty, blood-stained emergency room in Vietnam after I severed half my finger off in the jungle. No bedside graces there. Then the rock fall in the Yukon, not to mention the way worse boulder fall in Costa Rica, the mine shaft collapse in Montana, or that saltwater croc in Oz. Or the 16-foot tiger that I landed on in the Pacific versus the snakebite in Borneo. Countless close shaves. They all blur, all bad, yet all good. I am alive. There are too many to hold grudges. Life is all about the living. I am smiling. The next day I forget the crash. To me it is past. Accidents happen. It was no one's fault. Lessons learned. Listen to the voice. I move on. Hey, Si, I'm cool. Just buy me a pina colada when we're out of here. And I'll be sending you the evac doc and physio bills. He reaches for my hand. I love this man. We've lived some life out there. I look down to the floor at my rippled mountain salopettes, blood-stained jacket, smashed minicam, and broken goggles. I quietly wonder, when did all this craziness become my world? Part 1. The young do not know enough to be prudent, and therefore they attempt the impossible and achieve it, generation after generation. Pearl S. Buck. Walter Smiles, my great-grandfather, had a very clear dream for his life. As he breathed in the fresh, salty air of the Northern Irish coast that he loved so dearly, he gazed over the remote Copeland Islands of County Down. He vowed to himself that it would be here, at Portobello Point, on this wild, wind-swept cove, that one day he would return to live. He dreamt of making his fortune, marrying his true love, and building a house for his bride here, on this small cove overlooking this dramatic Irish coastline. It was a dream that would shape and ultimately end his life. Walter came from a strong line of self-motivated, determined folk. Not grand, not high society, but no-nonsense, family-minded go-getters. His grandfather had been Samuel Smiles, who, in 1859, authored the original motivational book, self-titled Self-Help. It was a landmark work and an instant bestseller, even outselling Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species when it was first launched. Samuel's book, Self-Help, also made plain the mantra that hard work and perseverance were the keys to personal progress. At a time in Victorian society where, as an Englishman, the world was your oyster if you had the get up and go to make things happen, his book Self-Help struck a chord. It became the ultimate Victorian how-to guide, empowering the everyday person to reach for the sky. And at its heart, it said that nobility is not a birthright, but is defined by our actions. It laid bare the simple but unspoken secrets for living a meaningful, fulfilling life. And it defined a gentleman in terms of character, not blood type. Riches and rank have no necessary connection with genuinely gentlemanly qualities. The poor man with a rich spirit is in all ways superior to the rich man with a poor spirit. To borrow St. Paul's words, the former is as having nothing and yet possessing all things, while the other, though possessing all things, has nothing. Only the poor in spirit are really poor. He who has lost all but retains his courage, cheerfulness, hope, virtue, and self-respect is still rich. Those were revolutionary words to Victorian aristocratic, class-ridden England. To drive the point home, and no doubt prick a few hereditary aristocratic egos along the way, Samuel made the point again that being a gentleman is something that has to be earned. There is no free pass to greatness. Samuel Smiles ends his book with the following moving story of the gentleman general. The gentleman is characterised by his sacrifice of self and preference of others in the little daily occurrences of life. We may cite the anecdote of the gallant Sir Ralph Abercrombie, of whom it is related that when mortally wounded in the Battle of Aboukir, and to ease his pain, a soldier's blanket was placed under his head, from which he experienced considerable relief. He asked what it was. "It's only a soldier's blanket," was the reply. "Whose blanket is it?" said he, half lifting himself up. "Only one of the men's." "I wish to know the name of the man whose blanket this is." "It's Duncan Roy's of the 42nd, Sir Ralph." "Then see that Duncan Roy gets his blanket this very night." Even to ease his dying agony, the general would not deprive the private soldier of his blanket for one night. As Samuel wrote, true courage and gentleness go hand in hand. It was in this family, belief system and heritage that Walter, my great-grandfather, grew up and dared to dream. Chapter 2. During the First World War, great-grandpa Walter sought action wherever and whenever he could. He was noted as one of those rare officers who found complete release in action. He obtained a pilot's certificate, but realising that action in the air was unlikely due to the lack of aircraft, he transferred as a sub-lieutenant to the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division, an early special forces organisation formed by Winston Churchill. Unlike the British officers on the Western Front, who were imprisoned in their trenches for months on end, he moved around many of the main theatres of war, and he was in his element. Even Walter's CO noted in an official report, "The cheerful acceptance of danger and hardship by Lieutenant Smiles is very noteworthy." He was then seconded to the Tsar's Russian Imperial Army to fight the Turks on the Caucasian front. And it was here that Walter was promoted swiftly, lieutenant in 1915, lieutenant commander in 1917, and commander in 1918. He was highly decorated during this time, receiving a DCO in 1916 and Bar in 1917. and mentioned in Dispatches 1919, along with Russian and Romanian decorations. The citation for his first ESO stated he was wounded on the 28th of November 1916 in Dobrigada. On coming out of hospital, he volunteered to lead a flying squadron for special duty around Bralia, and his gallantry on this occasion was the chief factor of success. On one occasion, when in action with a light armoured car, he got out twice to start it up under heavy fire. Being struck by a bullet, he rolled into a ditch and fought on all day under attack. Despite the fact that Walter was wounded, within 24 hours he was back with his unit, chomping at the bit. As soon as he was on his feet, he was leading his vehicles into action. Again, Walter was proving himself both recklessly committed and irresponsibly bold. Or irrepressibly bold. An extract from the Russian Journal in 1917 stated that Walter was an immensely courageous officer and a splendid fellow, and the Russian army commander wrote to Walter's commanding officer saying, "The outstanding bravery and unqualified gallantry of Lieutenant Commander Smiles have written a fine page in British military annals, and give me the opportunity of requesting for him the decoration of the highest order, namely the St. George of the 4th class." At the time, this was the highest gallantry award given by the Russians to any officer. To be honest, I grew up imagining that my great-grandfather, with a name like Walter, might have been stuffy or serious, and then I discover, after a bit of digging, that he was in fact wild, charismatic, and brave beyond the natural. I also love the fact that in the family portraits I have seen of Walter, he looks exactly like Jesse, my oldest son. That always makes me smile. Walter was a great man to be like. His medals are on our wall at home still today, and I never quite understood how brave a man my great-grandfather had been. After the war, Walter returned to India where he had been working previously. He was remembered as an employer who mixed freely with the natives, employed on his tea plantation, showed strong concern with the struggles of the lower caste. In 1930, he was knighted Sir Walter Smiles. It was on a ship sailing back from India to England that Walter met his wife-to-be, Margaret. Margaret was a very independent, middle-aged woman, heavily into playing bridge and polo, beautiful, feisty, and intolerant of fools. The last thing she expected as she settled into her gin and tonic and a game of cards on the deck of the transport ship was to fall in love. But that was how she met Walter, and that's often how love is. It comes unexpectedly, and it can change your life. Walter married Margaret soon after returning, despite her advancing years, and despite her advancing years, she soon fell pregnant, to her absolute horror. It just wasn't right for a lady in her 40s to give birth, so she thought, and she went about doing everything she possibly could to make the pregnancy fail. My grandmother, Patsy, who at this stage was an unborn child Margaret was carrying, recounts how her mother had promptly gone out and done the 3 worst things you can do if you're pregnant. She went for a very aggressive ride on a horse, drank half a bottle of gin, and then soaked for hours in a very hot bath. The plan failed, thank God, and in April 1921, Walter and Margaret's only child, Patricia, or Patsy, my grandmother, was born. On returning to Northern Ireland from India, Walter finally fulfilled his dream. He built Margaret a house on that very same point in County Down where he had stood so many years earlier. With a diplomat's mind and a sharp intellect, he then entered the world of politics, finally winning the Northern Irish seat of North Down in Ulster, where he served loyally. But on Saturday, 30th of January 1953, all of that was about to change. Walter was hoping to fly back home from Parliament in London to Ulster, but that night a storm was brewing, bringing with it some of the worst weather the UK had experienced for over a decade. His flight was duly cancelled, and instead he booked a seat on the night train to Stranraer. The next day, the storm building menacingly, Walter boarded the car ferry the Princess Victoria for Larne in Northern Ireland. The passengers were reassured that the vessel was fit to sail. Time was money, and the ferry was duly left port. What happened that night has affected the towns of Larne and Stranraer to this very day. Preventable accidents where man has foolishly challenged nature and lost. Do that to people. Note to self, take heed. Chapter 3. Walter and Margaret's house on the shores of Donaghey was known simply as Portivo Point. The lovingly built house commanded sweeping views over the coastline, where on a clear day you could see over to the distant islands and out to sea. It was and still is a magical place, but not on that night. On board the ferry, Walter watched the Scottish coastline fade as the steel flat-hulled ship slid out into the jaws of the awaiting tempest. The crossing became progressively rougher and rougher as the weather deteriorated even further. Until only a few miles from her Northern Irish destination, the Princess Victoria found herself in the middle of one of the most ferocious Irish sea storms ever witnessed. Initially, the ferry rode it, but a weakness in the stern doors would prove disastrous. Slowly the doors started to ship in water. As the seawater poured in and the waves began to break over the freeboard, the ship began to lose her ability to manoeuvre or make headway. The bilges also were struggling to cope. Leaking stern doors and an inability to clear excess water are a killer combination in any storm. It was only a matter of time before the sea would overpower her. Soon, swung broadside to the waves by the power of the wind, the Princess Victoria began to lurch and tilt under the weight of the incoming water. The captain ordered the lifeboats to be lowered. A survivor told the Ulster High Court that Walter was heard giving out instructions. "Carry on giving out life jackets to the women and children." Over the roar of the wind and the storm, the captain and his crew ushered the panic-stricken passengers into the lifeboats. No one was to know that they were lowering the women and children to their deaths. As the lifeboats were launched, the passengers were trapped in that dead man's zone between the hull of the steel ferry and the breaking white water of the oncoming waves. In the driving wind and rain, this was a fatal place to be caught. The lifeboats lurched and then pitched repeatedly under the violence of the breaking waves. They were unable to escape from the side of the ferry. The crew were powerless to make progress against the ferocity of the wind and waves until eventually, one by one, almost every lifeboat had been capsized. Survival time would now be reduced to minutes in the freezing Irish January sea. The storm was winning, and the speed with which the waves began to overpower the vessel now accelerated. The ferry was waging a losing battle against the elements. Both the captain and Walter knew it. The Donaghey lifeboat Sir Samuel Kelly set out in the ferocious sea at approximately 1:40 p.m. on the Saturday and managed to reach the stricken ferry. Fighting gale-force winds and waves, they began to retrieve only 33 of the 165 passengers. As a former pilot in the First World War, Walter had always preferred flying as a means of travel, rather than going by sea. Whenever he was in the Dakota flying over to Northern Ireland, he always asked for the front seat, joking that if it crashed, he wanted to die first. It was bitter irony that it wasn't a plane that was going to kill him, but the sea. Everything he could possibly do to help had been done, every avenue exhausted. No lifeboats remained. Walter quietly retired to his cabin to wait for the sea to deal her final blow. The wait wasn't long, but it must have felt like an eternity. The glass in Walter's cabin's porthole would have shattered into 1,000 fragments as it succumbed to the relentless pressure of the water. Walter, my great-grandfather, the captain of the Princess Victoria, and 129 other crew and passengers were soon swallowed by the blackness. Gone. They were only a few miles from the Ulster coast, almost within sight of Walter and Margaret's house at Portivo Point. Standing at the bay window of the drawing room, watching as the Coast Guard flares lit up the sky, summoning the Donaghey lifeboat crew to action stations, Margaret and her family could only wait anxiously and pray. Their prayers were never answered.